Book 4, Part 4 of The Sense of the Past by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Book 4, Part 4. The girl was, for the time, stillness incarnate. She carried the burden of what she had done very much after the fashion of a glass filled to the brim, held out at arm's length and sure to overflow at the first jostle. What she'd been mutely doing as she stood there must have been to beg her brother to refrain from any word that would make her position more awkward, and that she felt some confidence for this might have appeared the next instant in her large grave look at his companion, which struck Ralph as a sign of greeting the most intended, and yet at the same time the shyest ever made him. She might scarce have expected recognition, but she seemed to take him in with so little felt restriction on staring that he measured at once the relief she enjoyed at finding him only with Perry. She'd been wound up, he felt, for something more difficult, and now this was blessed, was a reprieve, for he was quickly certain that with Perry she could easily deal. All the more that what he had just said to her wasn't the deprecated jog, inasmuch as it didn't at all reflect upon her, but reflected only on their cousin. Ralph had in her presence still a couple more of extraordinarily swift reflections. One of these perhaps the very most immediate, in its sweetness and clearness, that had visited his consciousness of these rich hours, and bearing upon the fact exactly that he was her cousin, hers much more, for instance, than Molly's, in respect to whom the nature of the relative was swallowed up in the nature of the lover, bearing on it so happily that in the course of another moment he brought out the beautiful sense in his own greeting, which had the effect of reading into hers everything either he or she could have desired. He didn't grin for this, as he'd been doing for Perry. He breathed it softly, but ever so gravely. Cousin, 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 though after it, too, with the same gravity, which yet, as he felt even in uttering the words, was a perfect extravagance. Isn't it great? Great? Great that we're cousins? Great? It had broken her stillness happily, and, as he figured, without the jostle of her arm, for again it not only left her intrusion ideally unchallenged, but instantly gave it such importance of ground as could in no way whatever be taken from it. Well, what I call great, he returned in the liveliest promptitude of explanation, well aware, on the second thought, that it was one of the wrong kinds of turns, one of those that had made the rest of the family exchange wonderments, but eager within the moment to be able to judge whether it hadn't perhaps even positively pleased her. He calls things in such ways as you've never heard, Perry declared to her, as for further and possibly still more convenient information, which Ralph, rejoicing at the comparative sociability of it, straightway took up. Of course I do. I know it at once as soon as I've done it. Know it by the sound after. After, don't you see? He addressed the earnest emphasis only to the girl. Of course, we have different expressions, but I'm going to make you like them. I'm going to make you understand them, he explained in the most serious way. The happiest thing was that though her appearance had determined in him this sudden earnestness, the confidence shown in her and so quickly heaped up made her break into a smile. I'm not supposed to understand unless I very much want to. Therefore, she only smiled, but it gave Ralph an immediate chance. Therefore, it's clear that you want to, so far as I'm concerned, which it's a grand comfort to feel, for I'm not in the least afraid. What have you to be afraid of? She asked with a readiness that made her brother break in before Ralph could reply. You understand between you then, damme, things that I don't. Which comment, looking from one to the other, he at once and most surprisingly backed up. You've smashed the great jar of dry down, and he already knows it, and that you've come up to make your confession. "Oh, I don't in the least know that," Ralph declared. "What I should like to believe," he said to the girl, "is that you've wanted so to see your new kinsman that you've risked the adventure." His rejoicing gravity was at such a pitch in it that she turned under this address from pale to red, and that something in the expression thus produced in her, which was like a rush of some purer intelligence than he had yet touched among them all, determined in him the strangest inward cry, "Why, she's modern! Modern," he felt he was thinking, and it seemed to launch him with one push on an extraordinary sea. He, in fact, wouldn't have been sure the next moment whether he hadn't uttered the queer words. Queer, in their sense, even to his own apprehension, though he was afterwards to take it that they had appeared to find no echo, even if he had himself kept on knowing for the moment more or less what he meant by them. What he meant, and what if the air had vibrated to them, they would vividly have signified was the very aspect and figure of this slight, fine, concentrated little person, who suffered this last measure mainly indeed as an offered contrast to her splendid sister, and whose appearance was of a fashion so different from any that either Molly or their mother might have set her that she affected him as linked to them but in the degree of one of those sacrificed creatures he'd read of in records of the old Catholic world, the oblation made of the plainer and weaker and more thankless daughter to the cloistered life, the glory of God and the muster in the house of means for no more than one nuptial outfit. All of which, glimmering before him in what was perhaps, if we may choose, his quite most quickened perception, would have married ill with the special intensity of his recognition and qualification had the girl not, by some light and exquisite influence, pleaded against the idea that she concurred in the law of her effacement. She was as sober-hued as any nun, and might well, so far as the material side of her presence went, have been trained to fasts and vigils. But wasn't she rather distinguishably aware of more things in all the world than they, and of different ones from theirs, upon his honor, so that her longish, narrowish, almost colorless face, with the forehead markedly high and clear, such as to recall a like feature of some mothering virgin by Van Eyck or Memling, who dimly haunted him, though he couldn't possibly have met her in New York, showed a sort of concentration of consciousness, a strain and degree of expression which were all that could be referred to as in any way tricking it out. He had been spending a long time, as it seemed to him, with persons, positively to the number of 3, who were indicated to him now as having known, or at least as having been instructed by society, that they were pretty, well, clever enough for anything they might supposedly be concerned with. Whereas the light that hung during these moments about Sweet Nan, since Sweet Nan she at last, and not quite other than disconcertingly, was, appeared rather in that of intelligence rather at sea, or guessing free application to have been so perversely denied it that exactly this mild comfort was what it might have hovered and wavered there to appeal for. They hadn't denied her understanding, and Sir Cantifer had in the most pointed manner expressed her possession of it. But if there might have been a sense in Ralph's private greeting to her imaginable energies, it could scarce have helped involving the certitude that the family friend at any rate had read her most wrongly when he had quite most wished to distinguish her. She had suffered from what was wrong, though indeed without being at all pointedly aware of what was right. And this, even if it broke upon him as formidable that he should perhaps figure to her as a source of initiation. There were things in her world of imagination it had taken him so few instants to surmise, which might verily have matched with some of those, the shyer, the stranger, the as yet least embodied, that confusedly peopled his own. Though again, how any such verification of identities, felicities, sublimities, or whatever they might be, could make her modern without by the same stroke making him so, he naturally as yet failed of attention to discern. He hadn't, that he knew of, missed from the others any note of their direct command either of their future or of his own. he had only measured some disparities between his and their connection with the past, the effect of his sense of which was that they had the advantage of their perch upon accumulations and continuities, more substantially and above all more locally determined. This placed them so little less in the forefront of time that he should by rights at least have appeared to himself comparatively backward in the race. Whereby what would there have been in him to make in any special degree for fellowship with this young woman's originality? Never, let us hasten to add, could originality or any other inspired, independent strain have more renounced the benefit of a superficial show. The others, as he had seen, weren't proof against bewilderment, which, if she was so different, she ought to have been, but the first thing he now next asked himself was how he could ever, let what would come of this precipitated meeting be what it would, press upon her to the least confusion of her at best so troubled fineness. Modern, was she? All the more reason, then, why he should be at once as explanatory as he could. Certain passages of his recent past were affecting him by this time as almost superlatively ancient. And wasn't there one of them that would at once concern him in common kindness, let alone common honesty, to make known to her? "I wasn't aware of your existence," he at all events said to her, on taking to himself this perception. "I mean, I'd never heard of you when I sailed. Any more naturally enough than when I arrived. It's only been today. It came out unexpectedly. But now, I'm sure," he went on to the relief of his conscience, of his reason, of his imagination, of he could scarce have said what, to the rectification in any case of something he now knew, the confession made to have been hurting him like some limb kept in a posture adverse to its function. The gained ease was even too great for joking. He couldn't too plainly state it. "You see, I knew all about them, or I felt as if I'd done so as soon as I got here, which comes to the same thing, doesn't it?" There he was asking her that, by the way, as if she could tell him whether or no it came to the same thing. Would he have put such a question to her mother, to her sister, to her brother, or even to wondrous Sir Cantifer? It was the kind of question that tended to produce in them that arrest of intercourse, and, extraordinarily enough, it seemed now to hang but by a hair that it might under this new relation make everything easier. Was she going, sweet Nan, to be drawn to him just exactly by certain features of the play of freedom that he had felt warn the others off? Strange, certainly, that such a satisfaction should within so few moments have begun to breathe upon him, since as a satisfaction, and quite of the freshest, he should know it, that was beyond mistake, and there was nothing to light the anomaly to any degree in his impression that he should be able to make her conceive him better, simply by treating her, that is, by simply looking at her even, as if she naturally would. This act would be on his part a more conceiving, if withal a more wondering thing than any yet, though what had, for that matter, ever been so strange as that the shyest, vaguest, least directly protesting pair of eyes ever raised to him should at the same time submit to search after a fashion that was in itself a sort of engagement. "Don't you think you can persuade your brother to accept an accommodation?" he finally asked. She hadn't replied to his inquiry about its coming or not to the same thing as a proved case that he should have entertained the fancy of assurances. She had but left the appeal in the air. This, however, hadn't in the least stamped her to his vision as stupid. He had only felt at once how many still other things he could put to her. Here was one as to which he should really like her weight thrown if she would let it be, and since Perry had named his occasion, as to which, too, the idea of the explanatory grew in attraction instant. Clearly, she didn't yet understand, nonetheless, too many things at once awaiting her, and the accommodation to Perry, let alone to herself, not having had time to profit by what had at first been said. There was something of a tangle, but she caught the knot after another moment, by the light force of her readiest pressure. "Do you like my mother and my sister, now that you've seen them?" Ralph stared, for beautifully important as this point had been, she suddenly made it more so. "Why, cousin, I'm here as Molly's true lover. To marry her, you know, as soon as ever the banns can be published and her wedding gown bought. So that what sort of a figure should I cut if she wasn't as dear to me as life? She's greater even than I dreamed." Greater? She hung again on this term, as she'd done before. But it was as if something had happened since then, and she now met his idea in time. "Won't it be that you'll make her great?" "I hope with all my heart I shall make her happy. But she's splendid," Ralph gravely, almost sententiously said, "beyond any power of mine to show her off." He clung to his gravity, which somehow steadied him. So odd it was that the sense of her understanding wouldn't be abated, which even a particular lapse he could see. This ends Book 4, Part 4 of The Sense of the Past. This ends The Sense of the Past by Henry James. Notes, Part 1 of The Sense of the Past by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Notes, Part 1. The ambassador does, of course, think him a curious and interesting case of dementia, feels a kind of superior responsibility about him accordingly, is really in a manner fascinated and mystified too, and in short quite naturally and inevitably stretches a point to see him, as it were, safely home. This he has it on his mind and his nerves, on his sense of responsibility, effectively to do. But, as naturally, he mustn't acknowledge his conviction, even though Ralph invites him to. And I get, I think, what I want by making him come down to the street in the cab as from curiosity to test his visitor's extraordinary statement, and then plausibly propose or insist on getting in with him and tracking him, as it were, to his lair, so as to be able to have first-hand evidence of his material situation in the event of whatever further occupation. It's in the street and at the cab door that he makes the point of seeing home, as if then and there merely extemporized, and with the advantage that I thus seem to get what I remember originally groping for, having groped for, when I broke this off just here so many years ago. I gave up taking time to excogitate my missing link, my jump or transition from this last appearance of my young man's in the modern world, so to speak, and is coming up again where we next find him, after the dive in the old. I think I now have quite sufficiently got that transition. I have it perfectly before me. It passes between them, Ralph himself on their way in the cab, or probably better still, outside, on the pavement in Mansfield Square and before the house, expresses all I want, puts it, that is, to his benevolent friend, that he knows now perfectly that on opening the door of the house with his latchkey, he lets himself into the past. He disappears into the past, and what he has wanted is that his companion shall know he's there, shall be able to give that account of him if he's missed or wanted, shall also perhaps be able to take in all, whatever it is to be, that may yet happen, and believe in his experience if he ever rises to the surface again with it. This, of course, but clinches the ambassador's sense of the refined beauty of his mania, though at the same time the very law of my procedure here is to show what is passing in His Excellency's mind only through Ralph's detection and interpretation, Ralph's own expression of it, so leaving my own exhibition of it to stand over for my final chapter, my supreme denouement, when Aurora What's-Her-Name, under a tremendous psychic anxiety and distress of her own, which has been growing and growing within her commensurately with Ralph's own culmination of distress and anguish in his drama, which we so centrally and interestingly assist at, comes out to London for relief, and throws herself upon the ambassador with the strange story of her condition, matching and balancing so remarkably poor Ralph's own story of a number of months before. An essential point is that the time of duration of Ralph's plunge or dive is exactly the real time that has elapsed for those on the surface, some 6 months being about what I provisionally see. The horrid little old conceit of the dream that has only taken half an hour, or whatever any analogy with that I mean, to be utterly avoided. The duration is, in short, the real duration, and I know what I mean when I say that everything altogether corresponds. There it is, in the final situation that we get by a backward reference or action, the real logic and process of the ambassador's view of how it has seemed best to take the thing, and what it has seemed best to do in connection with his strange visitor's exhibition. He gives, he states, what has then determined and guided him, and I see that he states it to Aurora all sufficiently and vividly, so that we don't have any clumsiness of his going back to it, I mean to his account of his own procedure, with Ralph himself, when we have Ralph at last restored, and as what all that has gone on in the interval makes it saved from all the horror of the growing fear of not being saved, of being lost, of being in the past to stay, heartbreakingly to stay, and never know his own original precious present again, that horror which his conception of his adventure had never reckoned with, and his manner of getting saved from which, saved by the sacrifice, the self-sacrifice of the creature to whom he confesses, in his anguish of fear, the secret of who and what and how, etc., he is, constitutes the clue and crisis and climax of my action as I see it. It will take more working out, which will come but too abundantly, I seem to apprehend, as I go. But I have the substance of it. I have that still as I had it of old, in my vision, even if a trifle rough, of the 2 sisters, the mother, Mrs. So-and-so of Drydown, the brother of that period, and whoever or whatever else I may subordinately need, even to the point very possibly of a second young man, the third, that is, in all, who is a wooer or suitor of the younger sister, and, from my full kind of quasi-turn of the screw effect, is of a type of the period, entirely opposed to that of the brother. I see him. I have him and his affair, too thoroughly to have to waste words on him here. The more I get into my drama itself, the more magnificent, upon my word, I seem to see it and feel it, with such a tremendous lot of possibilities in it that I positively quake in dread of the muchness with which they threaten me. The slow growth on the part of the others of their fear of Ralph, even in the midst of their making much of him, as abnormal, as uncanny, as not like those they know of their own kind, etc., etc., and his fear just of theirs, with his double consciousness, alas, his being almost as right as possible for the period, and yet so intimately and secretly wrong, with his desire to mitigate so far as he can the malaise that he feels himself, do what he will, more and more produce. There must be an importance for him, about him, in the view of the others, and this must be definite and consist of some 2 or 3 very strong and vivid facts. Vivid, that is, to the imagination of the people of 1820. Rather beautiful does it seem to me to have 2 or 3 of his actual modern facts stick to him and operate in this sense that I try to project, notably his refinement, though he tries to conceal it, to dissimulate it, notably his being in 1820 as rich as he is, or was in 1910, which counts for an immense well-offness at the earlier period, and then his whole true modern attribute and quality, with a distinguished appearance to match it, and certain things dont il ne peut pas se défaire, that are of the modern pitch of material civilization, like his perfect and soigné teeth, for example, which that undentist age can't have known the like of, and which constitute a part of his troubled consciousness of complication. He dissimulates, he succeeds. He fits in above all because he pleases, pleases at the same time that he creates malaise by not being like them all, which it is that gives me what I just above threw out this question for his importance. Without the importance, I don't see the situation for him at all as I want it, and yet I must bring it in on lines of sufficient verisimilitude. Even though while I say this, the element so visualized fills me with the effect to be got out of it. I mean the charm and interest and fineness of that. In short, once I have the importance, as I say, I have everything. The rest all clusters around it. Yes, the more I think of the little man, he must be little, who circles about the younger sister, and of whom she has an intimate horror. He, rich, by the way, too, and thereby desired by the mother, and with a small sort of raffiné of that time, Horace Walpole atmosphere about him. But in short, I needn't talk of him thus. I possess him too entirely. I keep missing at the same time, all the while, my fact of putting the essence of what I see straight enough thus. The postulate of the young man from America arriving, coming upon the scene, somehow designated or arranged for in advance as to one or other of the sisters. I leave it rough and a little in the air, so to speak, for the moment. The just how and why I can dispose of in a page when in closer quarters. The point is that the wrong sister, abetted by the mother, pounces on him, as it were. It's the elder one I see doing this, and it so befalls that he is booked, as we say, to marry her, before, with all the precautions he has to keep, he can, as we also say, turn round. So it is that after a little, after the flush of the amusement of his extraordinary consciousness having begun a bit to abate in the light of the brutalities, etc., what I called to myself most conveniently his dawning anguish glimmers and glimmers, what it means to see himself married to the elder sister and locked up with her there in that form of the past. He conceals, he successfully does so, his growing malaise, all the effort and unrest of which, by the by, makes him, he sees, appear to them clever beyond anything they have ever dreamed of. They also, by the way, must pass for clever as 1820 understood it. And I catch also, parenthetically, at my need for their not being, with all their pride of gentility, at all as conveniently well off as they would like or must require, this fact helping greatly the importance for them that he is possessed of means that seem to them quite blessedly large. The note of their thrift, a certain hardness of meanness, the nature of their economies, the brutality, I keep coming back to that, of their various expedients, this and that and the other Ralph has to take in. Meanwhile, he is committed to the elder sister, and we have the effect on her of his importance, his means, his cleverness mixed up with that in him which is mystifying to all of them, but which the elder sister at first at least sets down to the action and the play of a cleverness, a strange cleverness from over the sea, such as she has never before conceived. She holds on and on to him even after the malaise, and his sense of it in them, with his still greater sense of it in himself, has quite begun, as it were, to rage, with which, I see somehow such beautiful things that I can hardly keep step with myself to expatiate and adumbrate coherently enough. Let me just nail 2 or 3 things, by 2 or 3 of the roughest, simplest strokes, in order to catch and hold them fast before I go on. All the while, the younger sister, who was ever so touching, charming, really appealing for him, all the while I know what I mean by this sufficiently just to see and note here that the elder does after a while break off under the action of the malaise, which Ralph is in the extraordinary position of having in a way to work against and being also, as a means of release to him, grateful to. I can't take time to catch it this moment, but keep it till the next chance. My notation of how and where the younger sister, the one who really would have been meant for him, the one for the sake of whom he would almost really swing off backward. My notation, I say, after a break of dictation, of the origin and growth of the special relationship between Ralph and herself, she being, of course, the nearest approach, and in fact it's very much of an approach, that I have in the whole thing to a heroine. I seem to myself now to have intended somehow in my original view an accident, a complication, a catastrophic perversity or fatality, as it were, through which Ralph has addressed himself from the first to the elder, the wrong sister, instead of the younger, the right. And when I try to recover what I so long ago had in my head about this, there glimmers out, there floats shyly back to me from afar, the sense of something like this, a bit difficult to put, though entirely expressible with patience. As I catch hold of a tip of the tail of it, yet again strikes me as adding to my action but another admirable twist. Of course, I am afraid of twists. I mean of their multiplying on my hands to the effect of too much lengthening and enlarging and sprawling. But the bit I speak of now is surely of the very essence of the situation. It connects itself with something so interesting and effective, so strong and fine to express from the moment one successfully tackles it. This, then, what I mentioned above, is that Ralph has taken over from the other party to his extraordinary arrangement certain indications that have been needed for starting the thing, and which I think of him as having, under the moment, so to speak, operation of the whole prodigy very considerably, very enormously assimilated. Enormous, however, as the assimilation may be, it is not absolutely perfect, and don't I exactly get out of this wavering margin this occurrence of spots and, where it falls short, just one of those effects of underlying distress, of sense of danger, as I comprehensively call it, which are of the very finest essence of one's general intention. He knows his way so much, and so far knows it wonderfully, finds his identity, the one he wears for the occasion, extraordinarily easy considering the miracle of it all. But the very beauty of the subject is in the fact of his at the same time watching his success, criticizing his failure, being both the other man and not the other man, being just sufficiently the other, his prior, his own self, not to be able to help living in that a bit too. Isn't it a part of what I call the beauty that this watching his concomitant, this watchful and critical, living in his own self, inevitably grows and grows from a certain moment on? And isn't it, for instance, quite magnificent that one sees this growth of it as inevitably promoted more and more by his sense of what I have noted as the malaise on the part of the others? Don't I see his divination and perception of that so affect and act upon him that little by little he begins to live more, to live most and most uneasily in, as what I refer to as his own, his prior self, and less uneasily less in his borrowed, his adventurous, that of his tremendous speculation, so to speak, rather than the other way round as has been the case at first. When his own, his original, conquers so much of the ground of that, then it is that what I have called his anguish gets fuller possession of it, it being so one thing to live in the past with the whole spirit, the whole candor of confidence and confidence of candor, that he would then have naturally had, and a totally different thing to find himself living in it without those things to possibility, those determinations of relation, those preponderant right instincts and, say, saving divinations. Don't I put it at first that he is excited and amused and exhilarated by the presence of these latter, by the freedom with which he lives and enjoys and sees and knows, the exhilaration proceeding during the at first time, as I put it, by the sense, the faintly intoxicating and spell-casting consciousness of how the inordinate business is going. His sense of success, which there is just enough of his critical margin or edge to appreciate, to estimate, and thus relate to his former consciousness, his whole starting point. This creates for him a part of the success with the others, by the very spirit and glamour to them, and that keeps up till the change. I visualize the inevitable difference, to phrase it roughly, begins by something that happens, something that springs out of the very situation itself, for portent, for determination, and which I must work out or work into. Exactly the right dramatic identity for. This I guarantee, but... And meanwhile I am ahead of my argument, and must hark back for a few minutes to what I left standing and waiting above. That this, which I was there about to follow up, at once withal, I see it in images which I must put as they come, and which make for me thus, don't I seem to feel, one of the first, if not the very first passages of my action. An action in action. An action must it thus inseparably be, as it has moreover so well started with being, from the first pulse to the last. Ralph, taking leave of the ambassador, the depository of his extraordinary truth, and the, as he hopes, secured connection with the world he cuts himself loose from, dropping as from a balloon thousands of feet up in the air, and not really knowing what smash or what magically soft concussion awaits him. Ralph, I say, in entering the house, then walks at a step straight into 1820, and, closing the door behind him, shuts out everything to which he has hitherto belonged. He is, from that minute, to his own eyes and all his own faculties, the young man in the portrait, the young man we have seen advance to him that night of his vigil in the drawing-room. This bridge or effective transition from the visit at the embassy to the central drama is thus found, and is as good as another for my purpose, swift and straight and simple and direct, as I have on a foregoing page, however, sufficiently stated. Well then, I want to make it, within, his arrival practically from America to the London family, as to which, however, on consideration, don't I see myself catch a bright betterment by not at all making him use a latchkey? To the fact of which an awkwardness and a difficulty would, I seem to make out, or do, rather, immediately attach. No latchkey, but a rat-a-tat on his own part at the big brass knocker, having effected which he stands there a moment, I think, his head very triumphantly high and confident, looking from the steps down at the ambassador on the pavement, this latter isolated now, by Ralph's having paid and discharged the cab, which has driven away, the moment they got out. What I glanced at as happening between them just thereafter takes place on the pavement, as I have noted, but with this difference. I see with a minute's further intensity of focusing that he does, well, what I have just stated. Only I seem to want a dumb passage between the two men, while the ambassador just stands, just lingers, as if now at last verily spellbound. I mustn't forget, by the way, that I have spoken of the rain, or that Ralph has, at the embassy, and that His Excellency can't be represented as standing there without a vehicle and under his umbrella. So it has been constate on their coming out of the embassy that the rain has stopped during Ralph's visit, so that it's all quite over when they reach the square. The ambassador has said, in reference to the cab, "Oh, I won't keep it. I'll walk home. You've really made me need to shake myself." Thereby I get him held there for a minute, seeing the last of Ralph, after the latter has knocked, and before the door is opened. Ralph turns on its opening. It is held open wide for the moment, and as I seem to see this altogether in latish daylight of a spring, say of a March or April season, it is no lighted interior that is for a moment exhibited, but just such a Bloomsbury entrance hall as may very well meet the eye today. Within, then, Ralph arrives, and what for the moment I want summarily to mark is simply that the elder sister is the first person in the drama that he sees. She must be handsome, very handsomer in an obvious way than the younger, not yet at all in sight. Not in sight, I think, till after the three others have been, the mother and the two young men, who will little announce and prepare her. It even may be a little, I think, that she is for the time away from home and doesn't return till after the situation is otherwise started. Well then, here it is that what Ralph knows, what he is in possession of and has the general preparation for, is so far precarious and, so to speak, treacherous, that, Well, all I want to say now is, before I break off, that he takes the elder one, for the right young woman. This seems easy. So right in her way does she appear to be. He knows, he has had it from the 1820 young man, what is expected of him in regard to one of the young women, how, in what manner, and on what terms, and by what understanding it has come to be expected, remaining questions that I shall adequately, not to say brilliantly, dispose of. What I seem to want is to get the relation between these two started on the spot, before any other relation whatever takes place for my young man, feeling as I do that once it is started, I can abundantly take care of it. I even ask myself whether I mayn't have my hero's very first impression, the very first of all, of my second man, as I call him, the one other than the brother, who's there for the second sister, and whom he should perhaps do well to find alone in the room when he is introduced, waiting there for the others, the objects of his call, and constituting Ralph's immediate impression. It is to them, say, that the first sister enters, so indefeasibly and luminously, as it were, do I see my procedure ruled by the drama, the quasi-scenic movement, or essential march and logic and consistency, at any rate. However, I'm not pretending in these words, in this rough scenario, to go into any but the most provisional and general particulars. What I want is that my young man should inevitably and naturally dazzle, and become aware of it by the very force of his feelings, feeling the distinction and privilege of the prodigious element that has launched him. The others don't in the least know what it is in him, but what I want to make ressortir from it is that he does the other fellow, his ancient prototype, the expected cousin from America, with no end of gentility, etc. There must be at the same time, of course, I see, enormous foreshortenings, great compression and presentation of picture. I want something of this sort to show before the second daughter turns up. Of course, such questions as whether it was of the period that the elder one, bred as girls of that time were bred, would come down to a couple of gentlemen visitors alone, and as by a kind of anticipation of our current modernity. Of course, such a detail as that is a perfectly easy thing to handle and make right. At the same time, withal, in respect to what I said just above about the scenic, let me keep before me how the very essence of all this is to stick as fast as possible to the precedent of the screw, in which foreshortening abounded, and I didn't and couldn't at all hand my subject over to the scenic. The present is, of course, a much larger and more complicated affair, lending itself much more to the scenic, even in a manner insisting on it a little, or a good bit. But I must guard, and all the while intensely guard myself none the less, or I shall sprawl out over ever so much more ground than I shall want, or at all need, for my best effect, to cover. If I may but look it well in the face, that the thing can only afford in a very minor degree, not in the least in a preponderant one, to express itself scenically, it takes very little further thinking to see how vital that is, and that the particular effect I want most to catch, that of the crescendo of the malaise, really demands and depends upon the non-scenic for its full triumph. I grasp this entirely. I see how narrative representation most permits, most effectively prepares and accompanies my turning of my present screw, and what a part picture and image and evoked aspect and sense can play for me in that connection. This ends Notes, Part 1. Notes, Part 2 of The Sense of the Past by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Notes, Part 2. I catch, it seems to me, with a certain amount of vision already 2 or 3, not to say 3 or 4, of my essential hinges, or, as I have called them, clues, that mark the turns or steps of the action. The first of these is the appearance on the scene of the second daughter, after things have got well under way in respect to the first. The first is the full-blown flower. She mustn't be at all too young, by the way, must be going on to 30, say, and very little trumpet blow takes place about her on the part of the others in advance, all pointing to the fact that she's a sort of neglected quantity, whom nevertheless the little Horace Walpole man does appreciate and pretend to, under all encouragement from the others who think him quite more than good enough for her, though not good enough, no, for the elder daughter. Beware, by the way, of any little false step here. Don't make the pretender in question too eligible, or, in the modern lingo, smart, since if this were so, Ralph wouldn't pass for more desirable. I must keep him a bit down in the right sort of way and degree, in comparison with Ralph, bearing in mind at the same time that a sort of leading note in it all is his, ours, sense of the hard old class rigor governing the life about him, and of which he sees the salience at every turn. The reappearance at home of the second girl, from wherever she's been, expressible in 10 words, at any rate is, as it were, my first clue or hinge, a fact, an impression, an apprehension that immediately makes such a difference for Ralph. I forget already whether I said just above that the H.W. man talks to him, takes him into his confidence about her, even to the point of recognizing to R that she doesn't care for his suit and has much incurred her mother's, sister's, and even her brother's reprobation by that attitude. Vividness to R of the reign of authority at that time, the much harder rule and discipline, and how half terrified at what she's doing by hanging back, by resisting, the poor girl herself is all the while. Her first relation to him is that of her appealing exactly from this rigor. Her first impression of him and emotion about him, he sees, he gives us to see, is that of a sudden this fine young American relation is a person who may side with her, may help her, may intervene and back her up in not accepting addresses from a person she can't get over her dislike of. Yes, that's their first basis, and for this appeal Ralph must have been prepared by his own sense of the kind of uncanny, to put it in a simplified way, little personage her aspirant is. They come nearer together on that, they meet on that, they talk, they begin to understand each other on that. Very great though Ralph's responsibility in the matter of backing up her refusal may be. It's at any rate the way the real relation with them, with him, his sense of the ancient brutality of the others to her, her mother, her brother, her sister, stirring finely within him. She hasn't dreamed herself, he sees, of any real equality of transaction, of relation with him at all. For if the others are under the dazzle, so much the more under it is she. She sees, that is, he sees that she sees. He likes her to like him, which is what gives her the sense of a privilege she trembles up into the enjoyment of, astonished at herself in her exquisite humility, this so touching to R, even while doing so. The great thing is that he gets into relation with them, and that by the time he has done so, the sense of how he needs it, the dim vagueness as yet of how she may perhaps help him, has begun to work in him. He sees, he feels, I make out, that she, as it were, understands him, though how and why she does demands full specification, that in fine what affects the others as his secret, as his queerness, as what they don't know what to make of in him, does the reverse of putting her off. It makes her somehow feel that beneath or within all his dazzle he's an object for pity about which she could perhaps do something. The ideal thing for dramatic interest and sharpness would be that there is just one matter in which, just one point at which, just one link with his other identity by which he betrays himself, gives himself away, testifies supremely to his alienism, abnormalism, the nature of his identity, in fine. The ideal thing would be that, I say, and that it should be definite and visible, absolutely catchable in the act, enough for her to seize it, come into possession of it, and yet not merely terrify or horrify her, affect her, in short, on the contrary, with but a finer yearningness of interest. The ideal, as I say, would be that this fact or circumstance should be tremendously right from the tone of the screw point of view, should be intensely in the note of that tone, should be a concrete and definite thing. Find it. Find it. Get it right, and it will be the making of the story. It must consist of something he has to do, some condition he has to execute, some moment he has to traverse, or write, or sacrifice he has to perform. Say even some liability he has to face, and the occurrence of which depends somehow on the state in which he keeps himself. I seem to see it. It glimmers upon me, though I didn't think of it at first. I hadn't originally got as far as it. It hovers before me, though in the form of the only thing it can be. When I call it a liability, I seem to catch it by the tip of the tail, seem to get a sort of sense of what it may in a manner be. Let me figure it out a bit, and under gentle, or rather patiently firm, direct pressure, it'll come out. He is liable then, say, to glimpses of vision of the other man, the one portrayed in the picture, and of whom he had had the portentous passage with before going to the ambassador. He's liable, put it, to recurrences of a sense of that presence, which thus, instead of being off in the boundless vast of the modern, that is, of the future, as he has described its being to the ambassador, does seem to him at times to hover and to menace, only not to the appearance or effect of reassuring or relieving him, but only to that of really quite mocking and not pitying him, of showing him to himself as sold, horribly sold. Say, as if it's the man of 1820, the Pendrel of that age, is having so much better a time in the modern, that is, in the future, than he is having in the present, his present, which is the past, that a chill and a fear, the growth of a despair and a terror, drop upon him from it, and signify somehow that he must begin to feel himself lost. That's it. That's it. That may be admirable, if I can get the right hinge or play for it, which of course I can. He hasn't expected it, I think, unless I represent something of it as coming back to him, while he wonders from that passage between him and the other fellow which we know, so far as we do know, only by his projection of it to the ambassador. After our having seen the other fellow approach, that is, at the climax of the first, or the critical night spent by Ralph in the house. We've come to know something of this later on by our sight of his own mental references to it, so that these relations may quite sufficiently hang together for us. Well, what I want is that once he has the extraordinary experience, the experience within the experience, of his being under observation by his alter ego, once he has had it in an acute form and connected it wonderingly with some cause, he feels liable to it again if the same kind of cause should recur, which by the time the phenomenon takes place has for him much more, as I have said above, a suggestion of menace than a suggestion of relief. That's it. It's as if with some other fellow feels, knows, and has some incalculable divination of his, Ralph's, weakening, while nothing is further from himself than to weaken, whereby Ralph connects, as I quite grasp, the consequence with the cause. There must be sequences here of the strongest, I make out, the successive driving in of the successive silver-headed nails at the very points and under the very taps that I reserve for them. That's it, the silver nail, the recurrence of place, the right place, the perfection and salience of each, and the trick is played. I seem to see it thus a silver nail that my young man recognizes. Well, what he does recognize, when the younger girl, for whom, as for them all, I should do well to provide a name without more delay, swims into his ken, and it's another one, another clou d'argent, when the wave of his confidence seems to have begun to spend itself, doing this, however, in face of something that has taken place. Just what this thing is must constitute another silver nail, and I see it thereby as some symptom given on the part of the others, of a change of attitude, a change of sensibility, as I must call it, or at least may, for want of a better word. I think it of superior force that they, the others, all except my young heroine, shall begin on their side the betrayal of malaise, which Ralph is then affected by, rather than that he should begin it, making it thus that they are by the operation, the outward betrayal of that condition of his own. Here I have the action of the little H.W., who, moved thereto, I express myself thus roughly, by the situation determined for his own interest through the terms appearing destined to develop between R and the girl. And this, though R isn't at all free for the girl, opens himself on the subject to the three others, and so calls their attention to certain things that they before long find themselves, and confess it to him and to each other, affected too in the sense he communicates. To be perfectly definite, it seems to me I must have it that the marriage of Ralph and the elder daughter is definitely arranged and fixed for a tolerably near date, since I want the elder girl, under the effect, to break off something, and there is nothing so good for her to break off as their engagement. The rupture of that with Ralph's apprehension of how and why it is coming and has come is of course a silver nail of perfect salience, just as it is another. I see that this catastrophe, or whatever one may call it, places Ralph and the younger girl face to face as they have not yet been placed. Their recognition of that, his at least, which is also a perception and a comprehension of hers, what has this in its concreteness but one more silver nail? What I see myself at the same time here concerned with is the question of the outward footing Ralph remains on, finds or makes possible, with the two other women, etc., when the rupture develops and after it has occurred. I can't have it end the relation, everything so collapsing, so that there must be still grounds for the relation, and they must be strong and positive, or at least definite and presentable. I get something by the provision that the engagement has not been given out, nor the marriage announced as to take place, which, meanwhile, is not at all natural unless some advantage not to be too lightly sacrificed is involved with their superficially keeping on. This requires thinking of, but doesn't in the least defy handling, and indeed I think I get it at a stroke by the fact that they all cling to him, in a sort, even in spite of the malaise, by reason of the convenience of proceeding from his means. Decidedly, yes, they must be, through disorders, extravagances, turpitudes, or whatever, of the late head of the family, and vraisemblablement through like actualities on the part of the son who has succeeded him in the proprietorship of Drydown, they must be on a hollow and quaking pecuniary basis, which makes Ralph have to have money, even though this wasn't in the least a common felicity or luxury in the American world of that period. None the less, were there some fortunes without overstrain of the point, and in short I have only to make Ralph all disposed, very peculiarly disposed indeed, and very particularly inspired and inwardly needing and wanting, to pay his way handsomely, to be the free-handed from over-the-sea relative of the house, in order to pick up whatever link might have seemed missing here, and make it serve my turn. He pays his way, he regales and treats, right and left, and nothing can be more in the note of a time I give him the sense of than the extraordinary readiness he finds in everyone to profit by this, the want of delicacy and dignity, by our modern measure, in the general attitude toward pecuniary favors. The smaller still lives on the greater, the minor folk on the great, and Ralph literally sees himself, feels himself, enjoys in a manner feeling himself, figure verily as one of the great by his taste of this play of money patronage that is open to him. There it is. If I get a clou d'argent by the rupture, in short, I get another, still another, by some dramatic demonstration of the fashion after which they are going, in spite of their malaise, to hold on to him as beneficiaries of a sort. Yes, I have it. The brother has borrowed money, borrowed it of him bravely from the first, and the brother opposes the rupture of the marriage for fear that, a complete rupture thus also involved, he will have to pay up to his creditor, his so probably indignant creditor, in consequence of the changed situation. The other two women know this and what it means for him, and then thereafter see that it needn't mean what they fear, what he fears, and isn't going to. For here I just get a sublime little silver nail in the fact that Ralph, comprehending this, beautifully seeing the way it may help him, quite seems to show on the contrary that he won't push his hand, won't expose their private gene, seeing what he can get for himself by not doing so. Doesn't he in fact even lend the brother more money, lend it after the very rupture, in order to reassure them and keep on with them, and show he doesn't mind the breach on the part of the elder girl? This all because it keeps him along and on the footing of his still possible relation with the younger. In plain terms, mayn't one put it that he buys, pays for in hard cash the pursuance of his opportunity, as well as put it that his dramatic assurance of this, with its readjustment of his footing, constitutes again a silver nail. There's nothing, I think, that one must so keep before one as that at first he's made ever so much of, much more of than he could at all have hoped. Well then, there he is with the question of the marriage ended, as to which, let me catch myself up to remember, I shall have to give her a motive, a presentable ground, since it's ended by her act, which won't make it too anomalous on his part that relations with the house are kept up. I must have him, by the way, not stay with them. I see advantages and naturalness, facilitations of several sorts, in his not doing that, but much rather putting up at one of the inns of a day, or better still in a lodging in one of the old West End streets. Why not let the young woman make it quite frank and outspoken, happy thought, and say in so many words that she can't marry him because, heaven help her, she's afraid of him, just that, simply afraid of him, even if he, with his own malaise at this note, can't get out of her any why when he challenges her, as in dignity and decency he must, for a reason. This much affects and impresses him, for there isn't in it, mind, the smallest hint or implication of its being through any jealousy of her sister, whom she doesn't so much as honor with a suspicion. The sort of Cinderella quality, so to call it, of the younger one, to be shown as more or less felt by him. The position thus taken with practical suddenness by his prospective bride is the first definite note, at all really sharp one, that he has to reckon with on the subject of the queerness that may so well hang about him, and it sets up thereby the beginnings of the great feeling that I want to impute to him. He thinks all the same at first, he expects and apprehends, not with pleasure, however, that this attitude of hers won't be supported by her mother and her brother, the thing having taken place between themselves only, and quite abruptly, she striking him as acting by her own sudden impulse alone, and in a matter not at all to suit the others. They will overbear her, he imagines. Her mother in particular will bring her round again and into line. He positively fears this even, so that his surprise is great, and his malaise even greater, when the mother, with a full opportunity by this time, doesn't so much as speak to him on the subject. There must be a passage between them, him and the mother, in which he wonderingly and observantly, watching now all symptoms and portents, as it were, waits for Mrs. So-and-so to speak, and broach the matter herself, to show him her knowledge of what her daughter has done. He must know, or must believe, that she has now the knowledge, this point having been treated between him and the daughter, as it were, in the scene of the rupture. He has, of course, to ask her if she throws him over with her mother's privity and approval, to which she replies that she doesn't up to then, that she's broken down but then and there, but that now at once, of course, she will report herself, so to speak, to her mother. I see it must be the case that she is plain and honest, not at all tortuous or perfidious, and so far as calculating, why calculating quite boldly and confessedly, as to the material advantages accruing, and thereby the more eloquent as to the inward feeling she can't surmount when she renounces these advantages so flatly. Well, the point is, from all this, that our young man is waiting for the mother to express to him that she mustn't on his side take advantage of the girl's backing out, but insistently claim his right not to be so trifled with, the attitude of the family being that they are, for all their straitened means, great people themselves, greater truly than he, and with a greatness for him in the connection, and is going on as if nothing has happened. He has expected from her, as in character, the information that she's dealt herself, and with the high maternal rigor that then prevailed, with the ridiculous child, whom she has thus reduced again to reason and docility. But nothing of that sort comes. The Lady of Drydown not only doesn't break ground to him herself in that sense, but betrays to his now considerably excited imagination a fear that he will, which will be truly awkward, embarrassing, and even scaring to her, so that what I seem to see happening is verily that when he thus watches her not speak, notes her as forbearing for reasons of her own, he doesn't take her up on it, decides that the question is really had out between them without either of them so speaking, and only by his looking her very hard in the eye, and her so looking at him, and his keeping it up on this and her keeping it up on that. It simply drops thus by its own force, the question of the marriage, and the fact that he doesn't have it out, and that she allows him, as by taking care no opportunity to, constitutes another silver nail, likewise, of as good a salience as I could desire. There it is, then, so far as that goes. And after I have dealt for an instant now with the question of what the brother's attitude also is in the connection, I see I shall have got what I was reaching out for considerably above, the particular thing taking or having taken place which must serve me as the determinant of the phenomenon, the factor I have settled to tackle. The other fellow appears to Ralph, and makes him ask himself why, contrary to all consistency or logic, the laws of the game, this extraordinary occurrence should take place. He feels it as portentous, feels it, I see, in a way altogether different from the way in which he felt it on the first great occasion, when it only uplifted and thrilled him, making him conscious of all his force, whereas it now disquiets and alarms him, makes him sound it for its logic and its reason, which he clearly enough interprets to himself. A difficult and intricate thread of exhibition here, but as fine and sharp as I require it if I only keep it so. It comes back to him, it comes over him, that he has freedom, and that his acting in independence, or at least acting with inevitability, has laid this trap for him, that he has deviated, and of necessity, from what would have happened in the other fellow's place and time. What would have happened is that he wouldn't have feared his prospective bride, he being the other fellow, and thus he, Ralph, has done the other fellow a violence, has wronged the personality of the other fellow in him, in himself, Ralph, by depriving him of the indicated, the consonant union with the fine, handsome, desirable girl whom the 1820 man would perfectly and successfully have been in love with, and whom he would have kept all unalarmedly and unsuspiciously in love with him. Deviation, violation, practical treachery, in fact, that is what Ralph's production and his effect on the two women, the mother sharing so in the offness of her daughter, amounts to and represents for him, aggravated moreover by the interest taken in, the community of feeling enjoyed with the younger girl, for whom, putting it in rough summary fashion, the other fellow wouldn't have cared a jot. I cling thus to, I work thus admirably, what I've called Ralph's insuperable and ineffaceable margin of independence, clinging taint of modernity, it being by his fine modern sense that the exquisite, the delicate, the worthy herself to be modern younger girl has affected him, in utter defiance of any capacity on the other fellow's part to appreciate or conceive any such value in her. Off in his inscrutable fact of being and of action the other fellow then has had, to his insuperable margin of antiquity, as opposed to modernity, his independent sensibility, though of a simpler and ruder, a harsher and heavier sort, and it is as a hovering messenger of this that my young man has, so to put it, drawn him down upon him. There it is. I get so my cause of my effect. I get my fact that the other party to the agreed, to experience, turns up, all unexpectedly, all alarmingly to my party, after a fashion to show that violence, that injury, as above formulated, has been done him, and as a protest against its being done further. I mustn't have this fact, I see, as repetitive, mustn't cheapen it with recurrence, must only have it, I seem to grasp, take place 3 times, each time with its own weight of meaning for that time, and then not take place again. It becomes thus each time a clou d'argent of the very sharpest salience. I see the first time as what one may call a warning. I see the second taking place after Ralph has told the younger girl of what has happened and what must take place between them on it has taken place. I see that as a retribution, or in other words, as a thumping, a tremendous aggravator of malaise. And I see the third as something which I will state in a minute after having said a word more about the second. The second constitutes, by which I mean the occasion of it does, a reflection of the intimacy, or at least the beautifully good understanding with the younger girl, determined for Ralph by his opening himself to her after the sensation just above formulated, proceeding from the rupture and the way the 2 other women have acted about it. It's only at this moment, and from this moment, that she becomes his confidant, all the difference being made by that. And don't I see it as an enormous little fact that whereas he goes on in silence, as it were, with the others, putting the 2 men out of the question, which is a point to be treated separately, he finds her in no ignorance, either real or pretended, but welling up virtually, with readiness to let him see that she knows. She knows, and I think he doesn't even quite understand why or how she knows, her possession of what she does know striking him as a matter beyond, in its quality, any communication of it that the others may have been capable of making her. The passage between them representing all this becomes then the determinant of what I have called the retributive, as distinguished from the merely warning reappearance of the other party. I just want to tuck in here provisionally, and before breaking off for the day, that I hold tight the motive, the dramatic value of the third reappearance, which resides in my heroine's relation to it. That is definitely not in her having it at all herself. That is not at all directly, but in her becoming aware of his having it, and, as it were, catching him in the act of the same. Work this out, express this better, or at least entirely, in my next go. I perfectly see it. It only wants clear statement. This ends Notes, Part 2. Notes, Part 3 of The Sense of the Past by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Notes, Part 3. I want the business just glanced at in the 4 or 5 foregoing lines to be as ideally right, of course, as it can possibly be made. Want to squeeze all the effective virtue out of it, in the sense of my generally intended color and tone, generally intended production of the new frisson as artfully as can be managed. Focusing on it a bit, I seem to catch the tip of a tail of the right possibility, though on further thought indeed I'm pulled up a little, not being sure it can't be bettered. For I was thinking a moment that she should, after all, have herself a direct apprehension, perception, or, speaking plainly, vision, have it in the sense that she exhibits herself to R at a given moment as plunged in stupefaction or confusion by having apparently seen him in double, that is, seen him, been sure of him, in a place where, in the conditions gone into or examined and discussed between them, he couldn't possibly have been. In other words, she has it to tell him that to her perception as well, by her experience of it the hour ago or whatever, he rose before her for certain moments in a reality with which everything proves in conflict. That, I say, was what a minute since glimmered upon me, Ralph's having it from her as the form of what I call in this connection my third big determinant. But no. What is immeasurably better than that he should have anything of the sort through herself is that she should have had it all absolutely through him. Pressing harder and more intelligently, I come back to the image, the so obviously finest, of her catching him under the squeeze, under the dire apprehension of this third occasion, which I seem to see I can make adequate and operative by her recognizing him, just that, after the right fashion, as doing his damnness not to show her, not to betray to her his intelligence of what he has to infer from, to read into, seeing it in an awful light, something that has just befallen him. It seems to me that I get it and give it for my best interest by our having it all in the form in which her taxing him with being in a state that she divines, yet but only half understands, determines his at last more or less abjectly confessing to. He breaks down under the beautiful pity of her divination, the wonder of her so feeling for him that she virtually knows, or knows enough. And the question is here, of course, isn't it whether for full lucidity of interest, full logic of movement, he doesn't let her know all, or in vulgar fictional parlance, reveal his secret? That's what it comes to, what it has to come to, very much indeed it would seem. That's what the situation would seem to mean, would appear to have to give, as who should say, of finest. Their being face to face over all the prodigious truth, which I think there ought to be a magnificent scene à faire in illustration of. The beauty, the pathos, the terror of it dwells thus in his throwing himself upon her for help to get out, literally help which she can somehow give him. The logic, the exquisite of this to be held tight hold of, with one's finger on every successive link of the chain. But, voyons un peu the logic, which expressed in the plainest, the most mathematical terms possible, is that what this retributive admonition signifies for him is, he feels, that he's going to be left, handed over to the condition of where and what, and above all, when he is, never saved, never rescued, never restored again by the termination of his adventure and his experience to his native temporal conditions, which he yearns for with an unutterable yearning. He has come to have his actual ones, the benighted, the dreadful ones in horror, and he just lets her know how horrible everything that surrounds her, everything that she herself is surrounded with and makes part of, have become for him, and under what a weight of despair he sinks if what has just again for the third time happened to him means that his fate is sealed. He breaks down to her, has the one outward, the one communicated despair that I see for him in the course of the affair. His throwing himself upon her for what she can do to avert that doom, his beseeching her all selfishly to help him. I say all selfishly for the dramatic, clumsily so to call it, working value of this. Connected, identical as it is with his readiness, in fact his intense hope of being able to profit by the idea of a liberation for him purchased on her part by some sacrifice by no means sufficiently of any hope of him, but of the very stuff of herself, and this up to the hilt. The more I look into this, the more I see in it, but with proportionately much therefore to be stated about it with a supreme lucidity. Reduced to its simplest expression, the case stands that he has fallen in love with her, done so in absolute rebound from a distress that her sister's, her mother's, breach has brought to an end for him, leaving him originally to throw himself so much on her by reaction, by already acquired and assimilated sense that with her, too blessedly, almost any ease for him, whether but comparatively or absolutely, is possible. Thus had he given way to his having, as who should say, fallen in love with her, and thus does that fact work to his perception, both toward his prime relief and toward his understanding of what he has to fear. Here I come to something pretty intricate and difficult, yet full of life and force, say frankly, of beauty, if I can get it straight, which is what I must proceed to. Why has what has passed up to then between this pair, why does it bring on or draw down the third, the retributive recurrence? Well, let us see if we don't make out, and thereby but store up still more beauty and intensity. Put it simply for the moment that the predecessor has been in love with the elder sister while, all unbeknowably at the time, the younger has been in love with him. That condition on her part, it appears to me, gives the link I want, the exact one for what Ralph finds of prepared, as it were, of reciprocal, of ground laid, for his first understandings with her, when once he has begun to feel the interfering malaise of the others. I am here, I quite recognize, brought up against the question of why, if the predecessor had been so in love then and there in the old time, he should have had this impulse to swing off into conditions so remote from those of the object of this sentiment. I get partly an answer to this, the fact that Ralph, shown as so much in love in the first book, has all the same embraced his opportunity to swing off into where we now have him. But I want something more than this, and I don't get it by simply leaning strongly on the attachment inspired in the man of 1820, inasmuch as the more he's been attached, the more explaining will the matter take, the matter flowering into that inordinate phenomenon of the original nocturnal meeting of the two men. If I give full value to the idea that the present Pendrel's pressure, his hovering, penetrating force, has had much the most to do with what has taken place, that though the man of 1820 has drawn the man of 1910 exact, though as to this I must make no modern date explicit of that, back into his own age, while the latter has drawn the former forward into his. Though I do this, I take care. I soigne the effect that Ralph has begun it, has exerted the original force, has been the determinant for the other and thrusted him his opportunity. This, in a general way, clears up a little the particular aspect of the case that I'm turning over. But don't I still nevertheless want something more than that? I want something that the predecessor may affect Ralph as definitely uttering to him and direfully reproaching him with. And perhaps as I dig into my material and insist on gouging what I want out of it, I meet this ground of resentment and reprobation for the predecessor that he feels, or rather that Ralph feels him to feel. For it can only be imputation on R's part, that he isn't, as it were, playing the game, ceases quite to play it from the moment that he inspires the elder girl, whom one had hit off so with dans le temps, with the alarm of distress and dislike that has operated for her rupture. I find something in that. I think, enough in that. Find it enough that Ralph recognizes himself as under displeasure, under vindictive displeasure, for not, as it were, playing the game. Let me make him put it for himself that the other man doesn't play the game either, from the moment that he thus comes in, reappears, as it were, as with the conscious purpose so to brouiller things, as under conscious purpose so to brouiller things. Have it clear that Ralph has no theory at all of what his double situation is off in his sphere. Put it that he is by way of having no sort of constructive or inferential or divinatory notion of that at all, which it would make an extraordinary complication to undertake to give him. By which I mean an impossible one, an unspeakable tangle within the limits altogether. Yes, the more I think, the more I seem to see this conception of Ralph's to be that the other fellow is endangered and incommoded in his sphere by what strikes him as R's practical perfidy and non-accomplishment. What makes this is that the two women, the two other men, etc., and the object of his preference above all, are thereby handed over to their intensity of malaise. I give Ralph as seeing and feeling and understanding him as rendered thereby vindictive, as convicting him accordingly of perfidy, and of decreeing the punishment which shall consist of not coming to his help, as I must show it as having figured in their original entente, that each shall come au besoin to the help of the other. Out of this little store of indications, at any rate, I shall be able surely to help myself to whatever in the connection and in closer quarters I find my best interest in. Definite it is, then, that, caught by his young friend in the fact of his intelligent alarm, he makes a clean breast to her of what he feels and understands, of what his intelligence most helps him to, of what, in a word, it is necessary that she shall know. Know, in order to assist and relieve him, do the particular thing that will so act for him and so bring the whole situation to the point of its denouement. What is then this particular thing? What can it be when I bring it down to a finer point, that is, bring the question down, than my general first notion brought it to? Here, the very closest and finest logic must govern all one's sequences. Altogether important and indispensable is it that he doesn't confess to her, really appeal and throw himself upon her, till she has so caught, as I say, and cornered him, that there's nothing else for him to do. That is that under the pity and perception and beauty of this, he absolutely can't but give in. I have provided above, or sought to, for the motive force establishing in her this capacity. I have sought to do so, I repeat, though I'm not sure I don't still feel a little uncomfortable at being able to do nothing better for her, as would appear, than simply recognize his woe. The beautiful thing would be for her to be able to refer this woe to some particular, some portentous observation or constatation already made by him, which question I examined and turned over above, without breaking down my objection to her directly sharing his vision. I at that point stated that I wished her but indirectly, but derivatively to do that, through her apprehension of a state into which it has put him. I seem to feel that this then isn't quite ideally adequate or good without I know not what more for her. The ability in her, say, to challenge him, first on some entirely concrete matter which has told her something for herself, something strange and prodigious, or at least deeply mystifying, in advance of the pressure brought to bear by her on him as an indicated, approved, or revealed sufferer, the pressure in fine that makes him break down. The trouble is that so I swing back again this way to too near the objectionability, and thereby ask myself if there isn't a way out, a happy thought in making her, instead of seeing something more than the normal, making her, as I have used the term, catch in the fact, something in excess of it, see something less, have the queerness of missing something, her miss of which needs to be explained. The miss, as I call it, corresponds and matches with his exposure to the retributive visitation, as I've called it, and something glimmers out for me in the way of the very occurrence itself, the fact of the visitation for him being marked startlingly and mystifyingly to her, not by his experience as in any degree detected by her, discernible to her, but by his apparent exclusion from any experience, or in other words, by an inexplicable lapse or suspension of his state of being at all. I think that if I can arrange that, her not finding him present when by all the laws and the logic of life he should be present, and so having to challenge him for an explanation. In short, I believe I do see something. He is extinguished for her senses by being in the grip of his face-to-faceness with the other man, and don't I make it out as arrangeable that this takes place in the very fact of his having appointed a tryst or rendezvous with her, at which he has found him, but in the midst of which he then astoundingly fails and, as it were, evaporates. I seem to see something like her having gone out to him by appointment, at dusk of evening, in the square, the enclosed square itself, where as she approaches she's recognized him within, has even spoken to him through the rails, while he awaits her, and there has had an exchanged word or two with her, directing her round to the gate, which she reaches and enters the enclosure by only to become sure, after moments and moments and moments of surprise and stupefaction, that he is definitely not there. I think I have it. It is at these moments, I mean during them, and under the influence exactly upon the other man of the appointment given her, that the retributive visitation takes place. So I get it enough. Get, in fact, all I need. The visitation over, he's in the place again. He is there before her. And what more natural challenge can I have for her than her alarmed question, that is her stupefied one, as to what in the world had during those moments, which I can make as long or as short for intensity as I like, what in the name of unanswerable wonder had become of him? He's therefore before her again, but before her with what has happened to him overwhelmingly marked upon him. I see what then takes place between them as a virtual counterpart, in the way of his telling his story, to a scene with the ambassador. The whole contents of Book 3, only all in the note of his depression, his unspeakable homesickness for his own time and place. Whereas the other whole passage had been in the note of his elation, eagerness, and confidence. He makes, as I say, a clean breast to her, as he had made it under the then essential restriction to the ambassador, with the immense difference, however, that whereas the effect in the latter case was to impress his then confidant with his being out of his mind, the present effect is marvelously, prodigiously, to make our heroine believe in the truth of his extraordinary case. Recognize how he puts it to her so because he has remained exactly so sane, and that it is prodigiously, marvelously, as the force in her to do so made be on her part, to his sanity exactly, to his convincing consistency, that she rallies. This rallying of hers is, of course, the very point for interest and beauty, for the climax of the romantic hocus-pocus, of my sought total effect, the very flower, so to speak, of what I noted a little back as my saine affaire. As I've already said repeatedly enough, he tells her all, which involves, of course, his telling her what he feels, has come to feel, in his being so cut off, so now conclusively and hopelessly cut off, from a life, from the whole magnificent world from which he is truant, unless something she perhaps can think of, may yet save him. His whole position becomes thus the plea to be saved, to be liberated, with his waiting on her devotion, her affection, her ingenuity, in a word, her inspiration, somehow to let him off. All sorts of things to be done with this in the beautiful and curious and interesting way, especially with the idea that she is sole among those of his actual life whom contact with him, the relation with him, doesn't now make afraid. Of course, this absence of fear on her part has to be based, has to have its own logic in order to have all its beauty. And when one asks oneself, why she only, thus extraordinarily, one seems both at once to be reduced for support, for illumination of it, to the fact that she loves him, and to the concomitant recognition that it must serve. For it is what exactly and immediately supplies to the situation between them the idea of her being able to operate somehow or other by sacrifice, her sacrifice, and of herself and her affections and her interest, somehow or other, so far as one doesn't make her interest in how to do it by its very intensity and, so to speak, curiosity and inspiring motive. I must have had him put it to her straight. How can you get me off? Can you release me from this apprehension of having really lost all I fear and fear I've lost? So that thus she has to throw herself back upon herself under pressure of this dire appeal, which involves, obviously, her using everything. For it would seem to me kind of sublime that he at last, opening out, everything that he has had before to keep back, tells her such things about those fruitions of the future which have constituted his state, tells her how poor a world she's stuck fast in compared with all the wonders and splendors that he's straining back to, and of which he now sees only the ripeness, richness, attraction, and civilization, the virtual perfection without a flaw, that she stands dazzled before it, and can only be shut up in the heartbreak of remaining so far back behind it, so dismally and excludedly out of it, while he, with her assistance, shaking her off after he has, as it were, used her, wins his way back to it and out of her sight and sense forever. Immense and interesting to show him as profiting by her assistance, without his being thereby mean or abject or heartless, in which light my affair can't afford, given the whole romantic note of it, to place him. Besides, the psychological truth and consistency here may back me to any extent. The great question is then of her assistance, how it's rendered, what it consists of, how he can take it from her, and how she can give it. I feel that my subject contains the exquisite rightness for this deep in its breast, if only I watch hard enough to see said rightness emerge as it were of itself, and as from the operation of what surrounds it. It dwells somehow deep in the fact, the great dramatic fact of the whole business, that she alone hasn't had the mistrust, the malaise, and the fear, in connection with which I seem to see something of no small, in fact of the greatest, pop out at me. If he has made her his full confession, don't I make out that to balance this, she also tells him about herself, something of the last intimacy? Not merely how she loves him, but something better still than that. Don't I in fact find myself just leaping and snatching at the idea which answers all my questions of procedure, and has my perfect solution just locked up and waiting within it? What is more than her confessing to him that she loves him? What gives the exhibitional further twist I was groping for is that she tells him she has loved the man he is a substitute for, the man of 1820, the real one of that actual year, and that in loving himself she has but obeyed the irresistible continuity and consistency involved in his force of representation. I seem to see really my ideal rightness in this, but must keep my head to state here what I see, for my perfect use round about it. I've already spoken far above of her having loved the other man, the real one, and done so as by the implication that Ralph knows it, is in possession of it, and has seen for himself what an identity and what a connection reside in it. By what means, however, has he originally known it, learnt it, got into possession of it, unless by one of the others having stated it to him? I ask myself which then of the others, but only at once to recognize the matter is already determined for me by what I have threshed out. He gets the knowledge effectively and, as I call it, dramatically, to all intents and purposes, scenically, by the fact that the little H.W. man, as I call him, betrays the wanted jealousy of him from the moment the elder girl breaks off from him. Up to that moment not, but after it, and on his turning to the younger, with whom the little H.W. man is, as I've shown, himself in love, then entirely. This jealousy is practically what leads to his profession of the truth, so that there can be no question of his needing it from her. He so reads it in her manière d'être, up to the time of and the great revolution constituted by the scène à faire. What we get thus is her manière d'être for him, all sufficient, all infinitely touching, before that scene, and her condition and her action after the same, which are two quite different things. Then, I mean in this latter case, her avowal, the only entire and direct one, is quite a different thing, out of which I have to pull, as I say, quite what I want. She has loved the man of 1820 all in himself. Keep every shade of discrimination here flawlessly clear. She has loved him wholly, without reward, of course, and even under his more than indifference, his degree of contempt, entirely addressed as he was and has been to her elder sister. Yet I pull up too here in the midst of my elation, though after a little I shall straighten everything out, to see that I introduce an element of confusion in trying to work the matter out as if anything can have preceded Ralph's conscious arrival. Awfully important, and not a little difficult here, not to let any tangle or any embroilment lay its insidious trap. Doesn't Ralph know by his own experience, if he takes up the action from the moment, and the moment only, of arriving for the first time, all that has happened for his predecessor and exactly what hasn't? There, however, is a question that would be embarrassing to me only if, on intenser reflection, I didn't see that I exactly haven't pretended that he doesn't repeat up to a certain point, the experience of the young man of the portrait. Just now, a page or two back, I lost my presence of mind. I let myself be scared by a momentary, confused appearance or assumption that he doesn't repeat it. I see on recovery of my wits, not to say of my wit, that he very exactly does, without which where is definitely that past, that made and achieved, that once living and enacted past, which is the field of his business. He deflects in the midst of it, yes, by the uncontrollability of his modernism. That is, at least, by what was incalculable beforehand, the exhibition of the way in which they were going to take it. The whole effect of my story is exactly his disconcerted and practically defeated face-to-faceness with the way in which they do take it. A matter, a fact, an appearance that gives me all I want for accounting for his deflection. Thus is our having, his having, everything en double, regulated and exhibited. He's doing over what the other fellow has done, though it acts for the other persons in it as if it were the first time. This quite all right, though not looking so at first, and that accordingly hangs together and stands firm. Therefore, accordingly, my start a little above, at being what I there for a moment called disconcerted and defeated, was groundless. I was going on perfectly straight and right, and am now doing so again. To repeat accordingly, I get my full right to deal as by a free hand with that little historic truth of the girl's concealed sentiment for the other fellow, accompanied with her equal consciousness that he doesn't and can't and won't care for her a bit, at least in the same way. This revolution that has taken place for her, and well before the scene of Ralph's differing so from the 1820 man. In short, note what occurs to me as to the question or no of whether the portrait in the house in 1910, is done from Ralph in 1820 or not, done from Ralph himself or accounted for as coming into existence afterwards. The thing at this ragged edge is to keep hold of the clue as tight as possible that I have grabbed for my solution in the line of her making the sacrifice, making it all with a sublime intelligence for him, on account of what he has told her of his own epoch, of which she stares at in her deprivation. This ends Notes, Part 3. Notes, Part 4 of The Sense of the Past by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Notes, Part 4. To clear up a little the page preceding this, instead of doing it over, I was making a statement, a bit arrested, as to the revolution that has taken place in the girl well previous to the scene of the great crisis, as to the attitude toward her of her sister's fiancé, from the moment she feels, exquisitely and almost incredulously feels, that difference in him toward her, which has been more completely defined since her sister's dismissal of him, and which gives her, as well as it gives him, a liberty never yet enjoyed by her. I shall presently come back to the rest of this, the enormous value to be got out of it. But I want not simply to brush by the small hairs started yesterday by that sudden remembrance of the question of the portrait figuring, or having figured, so extraordinarily to Ralph upwards of a century after its being painted, and which it would seem I must do something about. I see a chance to play with it, with the 1820 production of it, for illustration and intensification of my most sought effect. It's an excrescence perhaps upon the surface I have already in this rough fashion plotted out, which remark, however, is nonsense, as nothing is an excrescence that I may contributively work in. It gives me, moreover, the idea I begin to clutch the tip of the tail of. It gives me another person whom I suddenly see as a great enhancement for my action, the painter man who gets, doesn't one fancy, into a much straighter and closer psychologic and perceptive and mystified and mixed relation with his remarkable subject than any of the others in their way do. I get the painter man as affected in his way too by the famous malaise, and the more affected with his proportionately greater opportunities, as it were, if not of observation, at least of a kind of wondering and penetrating consideration. it kind of glimmers upon me that there would be something good, something much to the purpose, in having the painter-man begin to prepare the turn the situation takes, having him start the question of what the matter is, crudely speaking, with the genial young man, after all, and below and outside of his geniality, so that his wonderment, his felt queerness and queernesses are inevitably communicated by him and sow the seed of the rest of what I want. They sow above all, don't they, or mayn't they be made to, the seed of Ralph's suspicion of his being suspected, putting him on his guard against this latter, rendering him uneasy, and whatever else under the painter's study of him. Wouldn't it be then to the little H.W. man that the artist speaks of his strange impression, in complete confidence and secrecy at first, but sowing what I have called the seed so in the most favorable ground? I recognize that one doesn't quite see how we know he does this, as we don't, of course, see or hear him do it. Yet that needn't find itself so ill provided for by Ralph's himself making it out and concluding upon it, which is, after all, the only way we really know anything. I don't want to repeat what I have done at least a couple of times, I seem to remember, and notably in The Liar. The discovery, or the telltale representation of an element in the sitter written clear by the artist's projection of it on canvas. At the same time, I am not afraid. I see its office well enough, and needn't trouble if once the idea appeals, as I think it really does. In this case, it's worked in early, the notion of my young man having his portrait as a matter of course done in London, coming in with perfect naturalness. He has it done for his prospective bride. She takes an interest in it of the very greatest at first, and it is the little H.W. man who recommends, who selects the artist. I see all sorts of curious things in this. It perfectly bristles with them, and with one's chance above all of making the personage in question, and I do not want another figure, to people the canvas a little more, a real vision to Ralph, a character of the time intensely typical for Ralph, through whose sense of all which, however, I tread the delicate ground of imputations to him, of perceptions, discriminations, estimates more or less at variance with his 1820 identity. That delicate ground, I have only to remind myself, is absolutely the very most attaching ground of my process, solvitur ambulando. I have only to find myself in close quarters with it to get from it force and felicity. I present then the painter-man. I make him, do him, see him, and use him to very good purpose. Don't I kind of see Ralph's suspicion of being suspected come to a head in the sight of something produced on the little H.W. man's part, on his nerves and in his fancy, in fine, through an active correspondence with the malaise the artist has caused in him, through divinably feeling it himself? The foregoing difficult to state, but one is quite possessed of it. There's a great lot in it, only too much, alas, given my faculty for amplifying and going far. However, a rigorous right hand on the excess of that is my very law of life here. I do feel how an effective further twist or two hangs about the question of the portrait. We get it surely as painted full face on, with the rendered face, in other words, that is turned away from Ralph's 1910 vision of him on that night in the house. Yes, he sits for it in 1820. He sees it grow. He sees and feels what grows out of it. I really don't see why the fact of it, the high conceit of it, may do for me a good deal of my work. It plays a part in the situation, though I must square the difficulty of the artist feeling about his sitter, as he more and more does, and yet being able to keep his method and process, his application of his ability, well in hand, in order to put the thing through. It's a fine thing, a very fine one. I need it as that, for the finer it is, the more it plays its part in the state of sensibility all round at which we increasingly assist. The thing is done for the prospective bride, though she would have been much more likely to have been treated to a fine miniature. Alas, but no matter. And don't I see but the first stroke in the reaction on her part, as I may conveniently call it, is her abrupt, her sudden inconsequent refusal of the gift, in which she is backed by her mother. Perhaps she refuses it even before it is quite finished, for I want the artist to have spoken about it to the little H.W. man, so to put it, while the work is still in progress, which is also the time of the latter's opening himself about it, as Ralph makes out, to the two women. Here I have something, the pictures having been destined for the big panel over the principal drawing room, whereas the place in which my hero finds it in 1910 is the small inner retreat which I have handled in Book 2. The mother and daughter startle Ralph in 1820 by their expression of unwillingness to its hanging where it was intended, but as I want it still on the premises, want some compromise or right thing done about it, so that it shall be there for 1910, I see as arrangeable the business, the tension, the whole significant passage of its being relegated to the place where everyone concerned will least see it, short of its being turned out of the house, a circumstance I don't invoke. I have it there for the other man as his own portrait, when he is restored to his time by Ralph's liberation from it. I have it there because I want him in it, don't you see? For that wonder over it in which Ralph is held during his night of 1910. The other man comes back. The other man is in it in order to carry out his part, well, of what I have recorded. The sacrifice, the indispensable, unspeakable sacrifice on the girl's part, is involved in her relation to Ralph as she now knows him, and the quintessential drama of it, so to speak, is by the same token involved in his knowing her as she knows him, and as, above all, she is known by him. There hovers before me a something or other in this, a finer twist still, a deeper depth or higher flight of the situation, which seems worth looking into, and which in fact already appears to open out a good bit before me as I consider it. Isn't there something, isn't there even much, in the idea that when once these two have arrived, so to speak, at their understanding, at their mutual disclosures, or at least, that is, at his disclosure and her avowal, he becomes capable of a sort of sublimity in presence, as who should say, of her own, so that there is a kind of struggle between them as to who shall give up most, if I may put it in such a way, without excess of the kind of romanticism that I don't want, wanting as I do above all, constantly kept hold of and economized, never let go of nor perverted in the least, the unfailing presence, drawing in everything to itself, of that force of tone which makes the thing of the parente of the screw. So much is true and absolute, but doesn't prevent that I am wanting to put my finger on the very center of the point from which my young man's liberation is worked. What hovers before me at this pitch, as I just said, is the concetto that, sincerely affected by her sublimity, he's moved to match it, and in all sincerity, as I say, by offering to remain with her, as who should say, give up everything for her. From the moment he thus takes in that she gives him up for what is to herself utterly nothing, nothing but the exaltation of sacrifice. In short, what I see. I have it all, I possess it here, and now must give pause to this long out-ciphering. It seems to give me, after all, a fourth recurrence of the man of 1820, called back, as it were, by what takes place. I possess it. I hold it fast, simply noting the prime point in regard to my last book. Rather good and fine, I think, to make it that as the man of 1820 is called, since I think I do definitely give him his reintervention here, though probably at the cost of still keeping these down to 3 in number, and so running 2 of the others, as who should say, into 1. So the woman of 1910 is likewise called. So my fundamental idea that the solution of the solution comes about through Aurora's coming out, coming over, takes effect as I had planned it. The penultimate book ends on the climax I have in mind, as the Ambassador book ended and broke off with the two at the door of the house. And so the ultimate one puts Ralph always in London, and after the lapse of the real 6 months or whatever, face to face with his friend of book 1, to whom exactly what was foreshadowed in that book for my denouement had happened. Things for her consciousness, her imagination, her growing unrest, her own New York malaise, have happened to her too. Just how we are to know about them giving me, however, a little knot rightly to untie. I hate its being a little knot, savoring so of the perfunctory and the abbreviated. Yet how can I want it in the nature of things to do more than adequately balance with the dimensions or whatever of book first? The question is how, with the right sort of beauty of effect, to work in together the ambassador's reparticipation and her own, or rather, better put, hers and the ambassador's own, since I, of course, under penalty of the last infamy, stick here still as everywhere to our knowing these things but through Ralph's knowing them. It's a bit awkward that I seem to want Aurora's arrival in London and her appeal to the ambassador for assuagement of her literal climax of trouble. I seem to want that passage to precede my young man's reappearance, re-emergence, so to speak, and yet can't possibly have anything so artistically base. I want the rescue on this side of time by Aurora as the liberation for rescue on the other side of time has been by the girl of 1820. I want it to be on our actual ground by something that Aurora does. I want his restoration and recovery to take place actually and literally through her having got into such a psychic state, passed through such a psychic evolution over there, that she takes action at last, takes the very action that she sort of defied Ralph to make her take in that full, and would be at least so rich scene of the most preliminary order. What there took place essentially was, as he formulated it, that you would look at none but a man of, as it were, tremendous action and adventure, not being appealed to, however she might attenuate or sophisticate her arrangement of her case, by the mere person, the mere leader of the intellectual life, the mere liver in a cultivated corner, that Ralph has admitted himself to be to her, with a frankness and abjection, say, that his whole subsequent adventure represents his reaction against. The immense scope his reaction has found then, once he's got over into the old world, this has developed to the point that no prodigious adventure of any such figure as she may have had in mind comes within millions of miles of the prodigy of his adventure. Whereby my conceit is that all the while he is having this, all the while she, left to the after-sense of what has passed between them, gradually feels her state of mind, state of feeling, state of fancy, say, state of nerves, in fine, grow and grow, in a sort of way that is corresponding all the while to the stages of his experience, till the pitch of unsupportable anxiety and wonder is reached for her, and being able no longer to stand it, she comes out to London. I make her come to London through considerations, references, or whatever, plausible enough, and I make her by the same token want to see the ambassador, whom she approaches after the very fashion of Ralph's approach 6 months or whenever before, and as if he were almost, so to say, a father confessor. All this is feasible and amusing, rather beautiful to do, being what I mean, only it must come after, and by reference backward, so to call it, as I can only make the ambassador proceder in these renewals, for Ralph, of contact and apprehension. It isn't so much making him aware of the ambassador first, so to speak, that is the trouble, and making him then aware of Aurora by that personage, and what comes of reference on his part to the beautiful, uneasy, and inquiring creature of New York. It isn't so much the scene with that young woman herself then taking place. It isn't these that put their question to me, but the terms and conditions on and in which I have His Excellency and his young friend of the previous season confronted. What a blessing thus to find, accordingly, how the old gentle firmness of pressure, piously applied, doesn't fail to supply me. Our young friend is in the house again as he was in it in Book 2, the only little hitch being that I didn't show him as living there for the ambassador in Book 3. He goes to live there, goes with that escort to do so on the last page of the book, but by that very fact to pass into, well, everything that we have seen him in and which represents the rupture of continuity with the ambassador's period. So in short, perfectly, I see that, for consummate reasons, he can't receive this visitor on that exhausted scene at all, but must have the case otherwise, have it in fact just as it comes to me now. The ambassador, after his visit from Aurora, which we don't know about yet, don't know about it till Ralph has his knowledge of it from him, goes then, walks then, the day and the season being fine, and he walking with the largeness with which dear J.R.L. used to walk. He goes then, I say, to the place where he has last had sight of his so interestingly demented young man of said previous season. He goes there but to have the sensation, by which I mean, of course, the actual experience of seeing the very conditions in which he then parted with him practically renewed. The last thing he had stood there on the pavement before the house to see was Ralph's going in with that last look at him, and with the open door duly again closing on him. So, accordingly, the first thing he now sees is Ralph coming out again with the door closing on him from behind, and the first look the young man addresses to the world of 1910 resting exactly upon the confidant of his former embroilment. I like that. Like Ralph's coming straight out of everything we've been having, everything up to the very last sharp edge of it, straight back into this friend's hands. Well, how do I take up? That is, how does Ralph take up, and how does the ambassador, this fresh situation and relation? The ambassador, after his passage with a so handsome and so distracted young woman from New York, may well have some doubt and some question as to how, and be in some predicament about it. But I grant at once that Ralph has emerged from all trouble and now is, for the whole situation, supreme master and controller. He is all right at least, and he reconnects on the spot with all the lucidity and authority we can desire of him. His distinguished friend has come clearly on a visit to him, and he embraces that as well as he embraces their not going back into the house. At the previous season, as I've called it, he wasn't yet living in the house, he was only visiting it from his hotel or his lodgings. Yet it isn't to these, none the less, that I see him invite his caller to adjourn with him, but under the happiest inspiration, straight into the square itself, very pleasant now to sit in. I must rightly and neatly adjust together the times of the year, and in which, under its ancient form, by which I mean, of course, its earlier, he's been through the Seine affair of 1820. It strikes me as positively pretty that they go into the square together on the leafy June afternoon, and there it is, while they sit down, that the ambassador reports to him of the visit received at the embassy from Aurora. He has those things to tell to the young man, who had those others to do the like with as presented in Book 3, whereby it is very much he, or entirely he, who is the relator, reporter, exhibitor, with Ralph also for cross-questioner, as the ambassador himself was on the other occasion. I myself having, of course, too, my free hand for showing the elder man is really confessing to his genial bewilderment of interest. However, the extent to which I am possessed of this requires no dotting of i's, and the great point simply is that thus we get all we require, as a preliminary to the last pages of all of what has happened to or in, what has happened for and by Aurora. I scarcely need state that the upshot or conclusion of the two men's talk is that Ralph must of course at once see that young woman, which is the understanding on which the ambassador leaves him. But I am almost capable of wondering whether I'd best give this meeting, this reunion of theirs, in the facts and in the flesh, as it were. So aloof do I feel from the possibility of a kind of graceless literality. I shall see. I shall make up my mind. It will come in true ripeness. It can come but so, when I get in close nearness to it. I do seem to conceive that I can beautifully get all my needed value for final climax from taking it all out, or putting it all in, between the two men, especially after they've come out of the square together, for the ambassador to go, and they stand on the opposite pavement, the bit round the square, with the house over there in view. Ralph, of course, has told His Excellency nothing. Not a syllable of repetition of all that we've been having, of course, issues from him for his friend's illumination. He has only cross-questioned, only extracted everything about Aurora, only taken in how his triumph is complete and how that young woman has come down and round. It is thus a question, then, of his sending her a message, and of his sending it by the ambassador, for whom he sees her, justified thereto very vividly by the latter, simply and all so wonderingly wait. Yes, the message he sends is that he shall be glad to see her. He summons her to him, doesn't offer to go to her. He has said to his companion at first and for their going into the square that he's not staying at the house, and that his lodgings are elsewhere. The ambassador, taking the message, has the question virtually, "She's to come then to you at your hotel?" On which, after an hesitation and resting his eyes a moment over on the house, Ralph says, No, over there. But I should say I needn't here and now draw this out, and that I have it all and more than all, were it not that I just want to note more emphatically that I provide for everything, provide against the need of any small scene with the young woman from New York as a sequence to this full passage with the ambassador, and as a wind-up to the whole thing, together with the balance of such a chapter against the preliminary book first. I provide for everything, I say, by putting into this finale between the two men in the square, by making Ralph acquaint his visitor with, so to speak, all the requisite meaning resident in the appeal from their young woman that His Excellency has called to report on. I said above that Ralph tells the ambassador nothing, but only receives his own statement and cross-questions him on it. But that qualification refers only to what has been happening to R in his prodigious alternate character during the previous 6 months or whatever. Not a word about all that. But on the other hand, every word required to enable us to dispense with another scene for the young woman from New York. On that subject Ralph is fully informing, and what I mean and what I want is that this action in him, holding his interlocutor extraordinarily interested, shall so suffice for our own interest and satisfaction, shall so vividly take the place of it, that we simply shan't in the least miss, but shall find ourselves admirably do without any bringing on again of Aurora. The present and conclusive scene in the square all sufficiently brings her on, all sufficiently prefigures Ralph's reunion, not to say union, with her, and in short acquits me of everything. A far more ingenious stroke, surely, and to be made more ministrant to effect and to the kind of note of the strange that I want, than the comparatively platitudinous direct duo between the parties. He has only to give us in advance all that the duo must and will consist of in order to leave us just where, or at least just as, we want. This ends the notes to The Sense of the Past by Henry James.